3 minutes. That's all it took to prove everyone wrong. The radio crackled with static as dispatcher Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos at Denver Metro Emergency Command. All units, we have a code red hazmat situation at Riverside. Chemical plant. Estimated evacuation zone. 4-block radius. Backup hazmat team ETA 3 hours from Colorado Springs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Detective Lauren Hayes stood in the parking lot of Riverside Elementary, watching yellow school buses pull away in organized chaos. Parents clutched children against their chests, teachers counted heads twice, and sirens wailed from every direction. The chemical plant's emergency alarms had been screaming for 17 minutes, and nobody knew exactly what they were dealing with. "Jesus, look at that smoke," muttered Officer Blake Patterson, squinting at the billowing gray cloud rising from the industrial complex 6 blocks away. "That's not normal steam, is it?" Sergeant David Crawford shook his head, adjusting his radio. "Preliminary reports suggest a chlorine leak, but the plant supervisor isn't responding. Could be worse than that." He glanced around at the assembled first responders. Denver Fire's got their hazmat unit tied up in Commerce City. Aurora's team is handling that propane truck. Rollover on I-225. We're looking at 3 hours minimum before qualified personnel arrive. Lauren examined the evacuation perimeter map spread across the hood of Crawford's patrol car. Red zones, yellow zones, safe zones. All theoretical until someone could get close enough to identify the actual threat. The wind was shifting southeast, pushing whatever was leaking toward the residential district where families were still loading into cars and evacuation buses. "What about her?" Patterson nodded toward a woman in plain clothes standing near the fire department's command trailer. She wore dark pants, a simple gray jacket, and carried a small black case that didn't match anything the other emergency personnel had brought. "Haven't seen her before." Crawford consulted his incident roster. Dr. Emma Caldwell. "She's with the Environmental Protection Agency and happened to be in the area on routine inspection. Requested permission to assist with initial assessment." The assumption spread quickly among the assembled officers and firefighters. A federal bureaucrat, probably never seen a real emergency, definitely never suited up for anything more dangerous than a conference room presentation. Someone to keep updated, but not rely on when lives were at stake. Fire Captain Marcus Thompson approached their group, removing his helmet to wipe sweat from his forehead. 3 hours is too long," he said bluntly. "The wind's picking up and we don't know what we're dealing with. Could be chlorine gas, could be ammonia, could be something worse. The plant manufactures cleaning supplies, agricultural chemicals, and industrial solvents." "Are any of the plant workers still inside?" Lauren asked. "Unknown. The skeleton crew was on duty, maybe 8 people. Automated systems triggered the evacuation alarm, but we lost contact with plant security 23 minutes ago." Thompson pointed toward the industrial complex. "Front gates locked, loading dock access is compromised by the leak location, and we can't get close enough to assess without proper equipment." Officer Patricia Reeves joined the group, having just finished coordinating with the Red Cross evacuation. "Center, families are asking how long they'll be displaced. What do we tell them?" "Tell them we're working on it," Crawford replied, though his expression suggested uncertainty about the timeline. "EPA specialist is here, Denver hazmat team is en route, and we're establishing safe perimeter protocols." Around them, emergency vehicles continued arriving. Ambulances from 3 different hospitals, fire engines from surrounding districts, police units from Jefferson County providing mutual aid support. The parking lot resembled a staging area for major disaster response, but everyone was waiting for someone else to take point on actual assessment. Dr. Caldwell approached the command group with measured steps, her case held professionally at her side. "Sergeant Crawford?" I'd like to discuss access options for preliminary threat evaluation. Crawford looked up from his radio communication with dispatch. Doctor, we appreciate federal support, but protocol requires waiting for certified hazmat personnel. Liability issues, safety concerns, insurance requirements. I understand protocol, Caldwell replied quietly. I'm also aware that chlorine gas exposure can cause permanent lung damage within 30 minutes of onset, and ammonia vapor can create chemical burns in even shorter time frames. Captain Thompson studied her more carefully. Do you have experience with chemical incidents? Some, she said, which wasn't exactly an answer that inspired confidence among personnel, whose emergency response training emphasized detailed credentials and clear authority structures. Officer Patterson checked his watch. 2 hours 47 minutes until backup arrives. How long do we maintain the evacuation perimeter? Until threat is neutralized or contained, Crawford answered, though the practical implications were becoming problematic. Hotels were filling up, emergency shelters were activating, and local businesses were closing as the evacuation zone expanded based on wind direction predictions. Lauren studied Dr. Caldwell more closely, noting details that hadn't been obvious during initial introductions. Her boots were steel-toed and showed wear patterns suggesting frequent fieldwork rather than office assignments. Her jacket fit like someone accustomed to wearing protective equipment over civilian clothes. Most significantly, her breathing was completely controlled despite standing downwind from a chemical leak that was making other personnel uncomfortable. What's your assessment of wind dispersal patterns? Lauren asked. Caldwell glanced at the smoke plume, then checked a small device from her case that looked more sophisticated than standard EPA equipment. Current wind speed 8 miles per hour, southeast direction. If this is chlorine, we have approximately 47 minutes before concentration levels in the residential area exceed safe exposure limits for children and elderly residents. The specificity of her timeline was startling. Most estimates had been vague ranges based on general emergency protocols. How do you know that? Thompson asked. Atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, wind patterns, and basic chemistry. Caldwell replied matter-of-factly. Also, preliminary readings suggest this isn't chlorine. Every head turned toward her. What are you getting? Crawford asked, suddenly much more interested in her assessment. She checked her device again, frowning. Slightly. Hydrogen sulfide, possibly mixed with organic solvents. Significantly more dangerous than initial reports suggested. She looked up at the assembled personnel. We need immediate containment, not evacuation management. The silence stretched for several seconds as the implications registered. Hydrogen sulfide was lethal in much smaller concentrations than chlorine, with exposure symptoms that could appear hours after initial contact. The evacuation zone would need to expand significantly, affecting thousands more families. Are you certain? Thompson asked. Reasonably. Caldwell's voice carried quiet confidence that seemed inconsistent with her apparent position as routine EPA inspector. I'd like to get closer for definitive confirmation. Absolutely not, Crawford said immediately. Federal employee or not, you're not certified for hazmat entry without proper support. We wait for the specialists. Around them, radio chatter increased as word spread about potential hydrogen sulfide exposure. Additional ambulances were being dispatched. Poison Control Center was being notified. An evacuation perimeter was being expanded to include Riverside Community College, 3 miles southeast. Dr. Emma Caldwell stood quietly among the emergency personnel, watching smoke continue rising from the chemical plant while everyone waited for backup that was still nearly 3 hours away. Her small case remained at her side, and her expression suggested she was calculating something the rest of them hadn't considered yet. The Riverside chemical plant stretched across 12 acres of industrial landscape, its maze of pipes, storage, tanks and processing units, creating a labyrinth that even experienced plant workers navigated carefully. Built in 1987, the facility produced everything from household cleaning supplies to agricultural pesticides, storing dozens of different chemical compounds in various states of concentration and volatility. Building C, where the leak originated, housed the primary mixing operations. Automated systems controlled the blending of base chemicals into final products, but those same systems had gone silent when the emergency began. Without inside information, determining the exact nature of the leak meant getting close enough to read instrument panels and sample the air directly. Asterisk. The industrial complex sat in a valley between residential neighborhoods, creating natural wind tunnels that could accelerate chemical dispersal in unpredictable patterns. Storm drains from the facility connected to the larger municipal system, meaning any liquid runoff could contaminate water supplies for 3 surrounding districts. The location had been chosen decades earlier for manufacturing efficiency, not emergency response accessibility. Asterisk. Dr. Caldwell studied the facility layout on Captain Thompson's tablet, noting access points, ventilation systems, and storage locations marked on the architectural drawings. The complexity was immediately apparent: multiple chemical storage areas, interconnected piping systems, and emergency shutoff valves located throughout the facility rather than centralized in a single control room. Main electrical control is here. Thompson pointed to a building adjacent to the leak source. But automated safety systems should have isolated the affected area and shut down mixing operations. The problem is, we don't know if those systems are activated properly. Sergeant Crawford coordinated with dispatch through his radio headset, receiving updates from evacuation teams working the expanding perimeter. The Red Cross estimates 4,700 displaced residents if we extend the college campus. Hotels in downtown Denver are reporting capacity issues. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Sandra Mitchell from the Denver Fire Department's Technical Rescue Unit arrived with additional equipment and personnel trained in chemical emergencies. Her team began establishing decontamination stations at emergency medical protocols, preparing for potential exposure casualties. What's the EPA assessment? Mitchell asked, approaching Dr. Caldwell with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism about civilian involvement in tactical operations. Preliminary readings suggest hydrogen sulfide concentration at approximately 30 parts per million in the immediate area. Caldwell replied, checking her monitoring device. OSHA exposure limit is 20 ppm for 8-hour periods, but acute. Exposure at these levels can cause respiratory distress within minutes. Mitchell examined the device Caldwell was using, noting it appeared more sophisticated than standard EPA field equipment. That's a Gas Alert Quattro with custom sensors, not typical inspection gear. Standard equipment wasn't available on short notice, Caldwell replied, which didn't exactly explain how she'd acquired specialized detection equipment for a routine inspection visit. Officer Reeves returned from coordinating with hospital emergency departments, bringing updates that complicated the tactical situation. Children's Hospital Denver is activating their chemical exposure protocols. Presbyterian St. Joseph is clearing emergency beds. They're asking for estimated patient numbers. An exposure timeline. Timeline depends on containment, Crawford said. Current leak rate suggests we have maybe 90 minutes before residential exposure exceeds safe limits, even with wind dispersal. Captain Thompson studied weather data on his mobile terminal. Wind patterns are shifting. Current direction is southeast toward residential, but forecast shows possible northwestern turn in the next 2 hours. That would push contamination toward the downtown commercial district. The implications rippled through the assembled emergency personnel. Downtown Denver on a Tuesday afternoon meant thousands of office workers, retail employees, and pedestrians who couldn't be evacuated as efficiently as residential neighborhoods. The potential scope of the incident was expanding beyond local emergency response capabilities. Dr. Caldwell moved closer to the facility perimeter, observing the visible vapor plume rising from the industrial complex. The color and density suggested specific chemical compounds, and her monitoring equipment provided data that painted an increasingly urgent picture of the situation developing inside the plant. Hydrogen sulfide concentration is increasing, she announced to the command group. Current levels indicate active leak rather than residual vapor from contained spill. Lieutenant Mitchell consulted technical manuals on her tablet, cross-referencing chemical properties with emergency response protocols. Hydrogen sulfide is heavier than air, so it pools in low areas and confined spaces. If plant workers are still inside, they could be unconscious or worse by now. The sobering reality focused everyone's attention on the tactical challenges ahead. Standard protocol required hazmat-trained personnel with full protective equipment, air monitoring systems, communication backup, and emergency extraction procedures. The specialized team from Colorado Springs would arrive with all necessary equipment and expertise, but their estimated arrival time remained 2 hours and 38 minutes. Officer Patterson coordinated with Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, requesting additional perimeter control as evacuation zones expanded. They're sending 4 units and a mobile command post. ETA 45 minutes. We need to know what's happening inside that facility, Crawford said, stating the obvious challenge everyone was avoiding. Without plant personnel response and with communication systems down, we're operating blind. Dr. Caldwell checked her monitoring device again, frowning at readings that suggested the situation was deteriorating faster than initial projections indicated. The leak rate appears to be accelerating. Either containment systems failed completely, or secondary storage is becoming compromised. The technical complexity of chemical manufacturing meant dozens of potential failure points, each creating different hazards requiring different response approaches. Without specific knowledge of plant operations and current system status, emergency personnel were reduced to worst-case scenario planning and perimeter management. Captain Thompson received radio communication from Denver Fire Headquarters, providing updates on resource allocation and mutual aid coordination. Aurora Hazmat Team is releasing from their incident and redirecting here. ETA was reduced to 2 hours 15 minutes. Still too long, Crawford muttered, watching vapor plumes continue rising from the facility. Every minute we wait, contamination spreads further and exposure risk increases. Around them, emergency vehicles continued arriving as word spread through the regional response network. Specialized equipment trucks, additional ambulances, mobile laboratory units for environmental testing, and media vehicles beginning to establish positions beyond the safety perimeter. The incident was transitioning from local emergency to regional crisis, with implications extending far beyond the immediate chemical leak. Economic impact from business closures, environmental cleanup costs, potential legal liability, and long-term health monitoring for exposed residents would continue long after the immediate threat was contained. Dr. Caldwell stood quietly among the increasingly complex emergency response operation, her monitoring equipment providing data that painted an urgent picture of deteriorating conditions inside the chemical plant. Her case remained at her side, and her expression suggested she was evaluating options that others hadn't considered. The wind shifted slightly, pushing chemical vapors in a new direction that would require expanding evacuation zones even further. Time was running out, backup was still hours away, and the situation inside Riverside Chemical Plant remained a dangerous unknown that someone would need to resolve soon. The first attempt to gather intelligence came from Plant Supervisor Jake Morrison, who arrived at the command post 43 minutes after the initial alarm. His face was pale, and his hands shook slightly as he approached Sergeant Crawford with information that made everyone's situation assessment much worse. The mixing operation that triggered the alarm was processing a custom batch, Morrison explained. Consulting notes scrawled on a clipboard. Industrial degreaser concentrate, high-strength ammonia solution, and hydrogen sulfide catalyst. When the automated systems detected the leak, emergency protocols should have isolated the reaction chambers and activated neutralization procedures. Lieutenant Mitchell looked up from her tactical planning tablet. Should have? Communication with the control systems went down during the isolation sequence. We don't know if neutralization activated, if secondary containment is holding, or if the mixing process continued after the alarm. Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. Worst case scenario, we have 3 different chemical compounds reacting in an uncontrolled environment. The technical implications hit everyone simultaneously. Instead of a single hazardous material leak, they were potentially dealing with an ongoing chemical reaction, creating new toxic compounds that wouldn't be addressed by standard hazmat protocols. Dr. Caldwell moved closer to Morrison, her monitoring device showing readings that seemed to confirm his worst fears. Are the reaction chambers vented to the atmosphere or contained within building ventilation systems? Contained with filtered exhaust through the main stack, Morrison replied. But if filters are compromised or ventilation systems fail, everything goes directly outside. Captain Thompson studied facility schematics on his tablet, identifying ventilation pathways and exhaust locations. The complexity was staggering. Multiple air handling systems, emergency backup procedures, and automated safety controls that required specific knowledge to override or repair. How many plant workers were on duty when this started? Crawford asked. Morrison consulted his personnel roster. 7 total. 3 in packaging, 2 in quality control, 1 in maintenance, and 1 security guard. When the alarm activated, evacuation. Procedures called for immediate exit through primary routes, but double quotes. He hesitated. But what? Maintenance worker Tommy Chun was performing scheduled repairs on ventilation system controls in Building C, that's adjacent to the leak source. If he followed protocol, he would have tried to manually activate emergency systems before evacuating. The implication hung in the air like the toxic vapor still rising from the facility. Someone might still be inside, possibly unconscious from chemical exposure, possibly trying to contain the situation from inside the danger zone. Dr. Caldwell checked her monitoring equipment again, noting concentration levels that were continuing to climb rather than stabilizing. Hydrogen sulfide is now measuring 42 parts per million at this distance. If someone is still inside the building, they have minutes before losing consciousness. Officer Reeves coordinated with emergency medical teams, relaying information about potential exposure casualties and treatment protocols. Hospitals are asking about specific chemical combinations. Standard hydrogen sulfide treatment may not be effective if other compounds are involved. We need current readings from inside the facility. Mitchell stated the obvious problem everyone was avoiding. Asterisk. Without knowing exact chemical concentrations and reaction status, we're planning blind. Morrison provided building access codes and security information, but emphasized that emergency protocols required specialized equipment and training that none of the current personnel possessed. Insurance requirements, safety regulations, liability issues. No one enters without full hazmat certification and backup support. Dr. Caldwell walked toward the facility perimeter, stopping at the chain-link fence that marked the property boundary. Her monitoring device showed readings that painted an increasingly urgent picture of conditions inside the chemical plant. Concentration levels suggest active reaction continuing, she announced to the group. Whatever neutralization systems were supposed to activate, they either failed or are insufficient for current conditions. Crawford received radio updates from evacuation teams working expanded perimeters. Jefferson County reports residential evacuation nearly complete, but business district notification is taking longer than projected. We're looking at potential exposure for several thousand people if wind patterns shift. The weight of responsibility was becoming overwhelming. Local emergency personnel were trained for standard hazmat incidents with clear protocols and specialized support. This situation involved chemical engineering, automated system failures, and reaction chemistry that exceeded their training and experience. Captain Thompson attempted radio contact with plant security systems, hoping to reach any automated monitoring equipment that might provide internal readings. Static and silence were the only responses. Security cameras? Lieutenant Mitchell asked Morrison. Hardwired to the main control room, but that's in Building C adjacent to the leak. Even if equipment is functional, accessing monitors would require entering the contaminated area. Dr. Caldwell continued monitoring atmospheric readings, her equipment providing data that suggested the situation was evolving in real time rather than stabilizing. The chemical reaction inside the facility appeared to be generating new compounds. As it progressed, ammonia and hydrogen sulfide can create additional toxic compounds under certain temperature and pressure conditions, she explained to the group. Without knowing current reaction status, we can't predict exposure risks or effective treatment protocols. Officer Patterson coordinated with media relations, managing information release while avoiding public panic. News crews are setting up beyond the perimeter. They're asking about the timeline for resolution and resident return schedules. Tell them we're working on it, Crawford replied, though his expression suggested uncertainty about any realistic timeline for resolution. Around them, emergency response resources continued arriving, but each additional unit brought personnel who were equally limited by the lack of current information about conditions inside the facility. Equipment, expertise, and procedures were available, but no one had the specific data needed to develop an effective action plan. Dr. Caldwell approached Morrison with questions about plant layout, emergency systems, and operational procedures that demonstrated surprising familiarity with chemical manufacturing processes. Her questions were specific and technical, focusing on details that suggested more than casual knowledge of industrial operations. How long have you worked in environmental inspection? Morrison asked, noting her expertise seemed unusually comprehensive. For routine EPA duties. Long enough, Caldwell replied, which wasn't exactly an answer that satisfied anyone's curiosity about her background. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle lower, creating shadows that would complicate visual assessment of vapor plumes and chemical dispersal patterns. Weather forecasts showed possible wind changes that could push contamination toward populated areas currently outside the evacuation zone. Time was running short. Backup was still over 2 hours away, and someone needed to determine what was happening inside Riverside Chemical Plant before the situation deteriorated beyond local response capabilities. Dr. Caldwell stood at the facility perimeter, her monitoring equipment showing readings that painted an increasingly urgent picture. Her small case remained at her side, and her expression suggested she was calculating risks and options that others hadn't considered yet. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice from inside his supervisor's office, where he'd gone to check personnel records. Chun's emergency contact confirms he didn't make it home. His truck is still in the employee parking lot. He's definitely inside. That changed everything. What had been a hazmat containment operation was now a rescue mission with someone potentially unconscious from toxic exposure inside a facility where chemical reactions were continuing unchecked. Dr. Caldwell opened her black case for the first time, revealing equipment that made everyone stop talking. A military-grade atmospheric monitoring system, sealed communication device, tactical respiratory apparatus, and chemical neutralization compounds arranged with precision that suggested frequent field deployment rather than occasional inspections. Not EP, a standard issue, Lieutenant Mitchell observed, examining the sophisticated gear. No, it isn't, Caldwell replied matter-of-factly, assembling the monitoring system with movements that demonstrated extensive practical experience. CBRN detection suite, modified for industrial applications. Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threat assessment. Sergeant Crawford stepped closer, recognizing equipment specifications that exceeded civilian emergency response capabilities. Where did you get military chemical detection gear? Army Chemical Corps, Fort Leonard Wood. 12 years active duty, including 3 deployments to areas where chemical weapons were suspected. Currently on assignment with EPA's Emergency Response Division, which handles incidents beyond standard regulatory inspection. The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the emergency response operation. Dr. Emma Caldwell wasn't a routine inspector who happened to be in the area. She was a specialist specifically trained for exactly this type of crisis. Captain Thompson studied her equipment more carefully, noting components he recognized from joint training exercises with military hazmat units. You're qualified for hot zone entry? Certified for Level A through Level D protective equipment, trained in chemical identification and neutralization procedures, experienced with industrial facility emergency systems. She continued assembling her gear with efficiency that spoke of countless repetitions under stress conditions. Morrison returned from his office with building blueprints and emergency system manuals. Chun would have been working on ventilation controls in the mechanical room adjacent to Building C. If he tried to manually activate neutralization systems, he'd be in the most contaminated area of the facility. Dr. Caldwell studied the blueprints, identifying access routes, ventilation patterns, and emergency system locations with speed that impressed personnel who'd spent hours trying to understand the facility layout. Her finger traced pathways through the complex, noting strategic points where chemical concentrations could be measured and neutralization procedures initiated. Automated neutralization requires 3 separate manual confirmations to prevent accidental activation, Morrison explained. Chun would have had to reach control panels in Building C, the main processing area, and the chemical storage facility. How far apart are those locations? Caldwell asked. Maybe 200 meters total, but it means crossing through the active leak zone twice. Lieutenant Mitchell consulted emergency protocols on her tablet, finding regulations that specifically prohibited civilian entry into hot zones without full hazmat team support. Even with your qualifications, department policy requires minimum 2-person teams with communication backup and emergency extraction procedures. Policy assumes backup is available, Caldwell replied, checking atmospheric readings that showed chemical concentrations continuing to climb. Current hydrogen sulfide levels are approaching immediately dangerous to life and health thresholds. Ammonia concentration is creating respiratory hazards that will affect evacuation personnel within the hour. Officer Reeves received radio updates from perimeter teams reporting civilian health complaints consistent with chemical exposure, burning eyes, respiratory irritation, nausea. We've got families with children showing symptoms 3 blocks from the facility. Ambulances are transporting 4 people to Presbyterian St. Joseph. The situation was escalating beyond containment toward mass casualty incidents. Every minute of delay meant more people affected, larger contamination areas, and greater long-term health consequences for the community. Dr. Caldwell completed equipment checks with methodical precision, testing communication systems, calibrating atmospheric monitors, and preparing chemical neutralization compounds. Her movements demonstrated training that went far beyond academic knowledge or occasional field work. What's your assessment of entry feasibility? Crawford asked, recognizing expertise that exceeded anyone else's qualifications at the scene. Doable. With acceptable risk factors if neutralization systems can be activated quickly enough. She studied facility schematics again, calculating timing and exposure variables. The main challenge is identifying exact chemical reaction status before attempting neutralization procedures. Morrison provided access codes and emergency override procedures, emphasizing safety protocols that had been designed for trained plant personnel working in normal conditions, rather than emergency responders dealing with ongoing chemical reactions. Building. C control panels require manual input of shutdown sequences that take approximately 90 seconds to complete, he explained. During that time, operator exposure to chemical vapors would be direct and continuous. Captain Thompson coordinated with medical teams, ensuring emergency treatment protocols were established for chemical exposure casualties. If you attempt entry and become incapacitated, extraction procedures will be limited by the same chemical hazards, preventing current rescue operations. The tactical reality was stark. Someone needed to enter the facility to rescue Chun and activate neutralization systems, but that same someone risked becoming another casualty, requiring rescue by backup teams, still hours away. Dr. Caldwell checked her respiratory equipment, ensuring proper seal and function testing that demonstrated familiarity with protective gear under actual emergency conditions rather than training exercises. Her communication device was military specification, designed for operation in environments where standard equipment failed. Time to neutralize completion once systems are activated? She asked Morrison. Approximately 15 minutes for primary reaction chambers, another 10 minutes for secondary containment verification. Lieutenant Mitchell calculated exposure timelines and evacuation requirements, recognizing that successful neutralization would allow emergency response to transition from crisis management to cleanup operations. What's your confidence level for completing neutralization procedures? Dr. Caldwell assembled her gear with final checks that demonstrated preparation for entry into an environment where mistakes meant death. High confidence for system activation, moderate confidence for extraction without complications. Around them, emergency personnel watched, someone prepare for a mission that represented their only realistic option for resolving the crisis, before it expanded beyond local response capabilities. Her equipment, training, and experience offered possibilities where protocol and procedures had reached their limits. Sergeant Crawford received radio confirmation that backup hazmat teams were still 97 minutes out. Traffic conditions were delaying additional resources and wind patterns were shifting toward more populated areas. "Ma'am," he said formally, acknowledging expertise and authority that transcended normal emergency response hierarchy, "if you're willing to attempt entry, you have full departmental support and coordination." Dr. Caldwell checked her watch, calculating timing variables for entry, neutralization, rescue, and extraction. Her expression suggested someone evaluating risks that had become acceptable only because alternatives were worse. "Give me real-time atmospheric monitoring, communication backup every 30 seconds, and emergency extraction procedures if something goes wrong," she said, preparing to enter Riverside Chemical Plant alone. Dr. Caldwell sealed her respiratory apparatus and activated her communication system. Entry commencing at 15:47 hours. Atmospheric monitoring shows hydrogen sulfide at 63 ppm, ammonia at 41 ppm. Beginning approach to Building C. She moved through the facility gates with tactical precision that impressed every emergency responder watching from the command post. Her path avoided open areas where chemical vapor concentration was highest, utilizing building shadows and prevailing wind patterns to minimize exposure during approach. Visual on Building C entrance. Her voice came through the radio with crystal clarity. Vapor plume indicates active leak from the second-floor mixing chamber. Proceeding to the ground level. Access point. Lieutenant Mitchell tracked her progress through binoculars, noting movement techniques that demonstrated training in hostile environment navigation. She's maintaining optimal distance from the primary contamination source while advancing toward. Control systems. Inside Building C, Caldwell's headlamp illuminated abandoned workstations where automated systems had attempted emergency shutdown procedures before communication systems failed. Her atmospheric monitor showed chemical concentrations that would have been immediately lethal without proper respiratory protection. Reaching the first control panel, she reported. Beginning neutralization sequence alpha. Manual override requires 90-second completion time. Her fingers moved across control interfaces with speed and precision that suggested extensive experience with chemical facility emergency systems. Warning lights flashed as safety protocols recognized manual intervention, requiring multiple confirmations to prevent accidental activation of neutralization procedures. Sequence Alpha complete. Moving to Building D for the confirmation panel. The second control location required crossing through the main contamination zone where chemical vapors were creating visibility problems even with proper protective equipment. Caldwell navigated by memory of facility blueprints, moving efficiently through areas where hesitation meant increased exposure. Visual contact with potential casualty. Her voice remained calm despite the discovery everyone had been dreading. Male individual, unconscious, positioned near ventilation controls, beginning casualty assessment. Tommy Chun lay motionless beside control panels he'd been attempting to activate when chemical exposure overcame him. Caldwell checked for pulse and respiratory function while simultaneously completing neutralization sequence confirmations, required to stop the ongoing chemical reaction. Casualty shows weak pulse, irregular breathing consistent with hydrogen sulfide exposure. Initiating emergency medical procedures while completing neutralization protocols. She administered emergency antidote from her medical kit while inputting final control sequences that would activate facility-wide neutralization systems. The combination of medical response and technical procedures demonstrated multitasking capabilities that exceeded normal emergency training. Neutralization sequence beta complete. Chemical reactions should begin terminating in approximately 30 seconds. Throughout the facility, automated systems responded to manual override commands by injecting neutralizing compounds into reaction chambers and activating enhanced ventilation procedures designed to clear contaminated air rapidly. Atmospheric readings showing immediate improvement. Hydrogen sulfide dropping to 41 ppm and declining. Preparing casualty for emergency extraction. Caldwell secured Chun for transport, utilizing tactical carry techniques that allowed movement through contaminated areas while maintaining protective equipment integrity for both herself and the unconscious worker. Beginning extraction with casualty. ATA to the decontamination station in 4 minutes. Captain Thompson coordinated emergency medical response, ensuring ambulance crews were prepared for chemical exposure treatment and that decontamination procedures were ready for both rescuer and casualty. Her emergence from Building C, with Chun carried in the proper emergency transport position, demonstrated training that went far beyond civilian emergency response capabilities. Emergency medical technicians immediately began advanced treatment procedures while decontamination teams processed both individuals through protocols designed for chemical exposure incidents. Casualty pulse strengthening, respiratory function improving, reported EMT Sarah Rodriguez as Chun was loaded into the ambulance. Chemical exposure treatment appears effective. Transport to Presbyterian St. Joseph Emergency Department for continued monitoring. Dr. Caldwell completed decontamination procedures with efficiency that suggested routine rather than exceptional circumstances. Her equipment was systematically cleaned and secured, and her medical evaluation showed no signs of chemical exposure. despite spending nearly 8 minutes inside the contaminated facility. Neutralization systems are functioning properly, she reported to the assembled emergency personnel. Chemical reaction has been terminated. Atmospheric concentrations are dropping rapidly. The facility should be safe for standard hazmat team. Entry within approximately 20 minutes. The transformation was immediate and obvious. Atmospheric monitoring equipment throughout the perimeter showed chemical concentrations declining towards safe levels as neutralization procedures eliminated the source of ongoing contamination. Morrison checked facility systems through his remote monitoring equipment, confirming that automated safety procedures were now functioning properly and that chemical storage areas showed no signs of secondary contamination or continued reaction. All systems showing green status, he announced to the command post. Emergency neutralization was completely successful. We're transitioning from an active crisis to the cleanup and investigation phase. Sergeant Crawford coordinated with evacuation teams, beginning procedures for resident notification and controlled return to previously evacuated areas. Initial area clearance can begin within the hour. Full residential return within 4 hours pending final atmospheric verification. Lieutenant Mitchell coordinated with hospital emergency departments, confirming that Chun's condition was stabilizing and that no additional chemical exposure casualties had been reported from the expanded evacuation areas. Asterisk. The radio chatter shifted from crisis management to administrative coordination as emergency response teams transitioned from active emergency to cleanup and investigation procedures. The crisis that had threatened thousands of residents and required massive resource deployment had been resolved in less than 10 minutes by one person with proper training and equipment. Dr. Caldwell completed post-incident documentation with the same methodical precision she demonstrated throughout the emergency. Her report included atmospheric readings, neutralization procedures, casualty medical status, and recommendations for preventing similar incidents. Outstanding work. Colonel Harrison's voice came through the command radio, apparently backup. Teams from Colorado Springs had been monitoring the incident remotely and had witnessed the entire resolution through tactical communications. Doctor, your actions today prevented what could have been a mass casualty incident affecting thousands of residents. The speed and precision of your response exceeded all expectations for emergency incident resolution. Around the command post, emergency personnel who had initially dismissed her as routine EPA inspection staff were reassessing their understanding of individual capabilities and the importance of accurate threat evaluation. Officer Patterson approached with professional respect that military personnel used when acknowledging superior competence. Ma'am, I believe several of us owe you significant apologies for our initial assumptions about your qualifications. Captain Thompson coordinated with Incident Command, filing reports that would document exceptional emergency response and ensure that lessons learned would benefit future training and preparedness programs. Response time from entry to neutralization completion was exactly 7 minutes 38 seconds, he announced. Crisis resolution that prevented major regional emergencies and potentially saved lives throughout the Denver metropolitan area. The story was already spreading through regional emergency response networks as personnel realized they had witnessed demonstration of capabilities that redefined expectations for individual emergency response effectiveness. By 16:15 hours, families were returning to their homes. Children ran across lawns where emergency vehicles had been parked just hours earlier, and the smell of barbecue grills replaced the acrid tang of chemical vapor. What had threatened to become Denver's worst industrial disaster since the 1990s had been resolved so quickly that most residents never fully understood how close they'd come to catastrophe. Tommy Chun opened his eyes in Presbyterian St. Joseph's emergency department at 1723, asking for water and wondering why he was wearing a hospital gown. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the attending physician, explained that chemical exposure had rendered him unconscious for nearly 3 hours, but early intervention had prevented permanent damage. "Someone came in after me?" Chun asked, his voice hoarse from respiratory irritation. "A PA specialist, military background. She carried you out while simultaneously shutting down the chemical reaction that was poisoning the air." Dr. Hernandez checked his vital signs, noting continued improvement. Without her intervention, exposure time would have caused permanent lung damage or worse. Chun would make a full recovery, returning to work 6 weeks later with new respect for safety protocols and emergency procedures. More significantly, his experience would lead to comprehensive facility safety improvements that became industry standards throughout Colorado. The specialized hazmat team from Colorado Springs arrived at Riverside Chemical Plant at 1834, 2 hours after the crisis had been resolved. Team leader Captain Robert Hayes surveyed a facility where atmospheric readings showed safe levels, neutralization systems functioning properly, and cleanup operations proceeding under normal protocols. "Most effective emergency response I've seen in 15 years, he reported to the regional command. Single operators achieved results that typically require full team deployment with extensive preparation time. The incident report filed by Captain Hayes would be distributed throughout federal emergency response networks, becoming required reading for advanced hazmat training programs and setting new benchmarks for individual emergency response capabilities. Dr. Caldwell completed her equipment inventory and documentation at the temporary command post, preparing to return to routine EPA duties as if resolving regional chemical crises was standard procedure. Her gear was cleaned, calibrated, and secured with the same methodical precision she demonstrated throughout the emergency. Morrison approached her as she prepared to leave, carrying a facility safety manual and revised emergency procedures that had been hastily updated based on lessons learned from the incident. "Doctor, I've been a plant supervisor for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished today." He extended his hand with genuine gratitude. "You saved my employee's life and prevented contamination that could have affected thousands of people." "Chemical emergencies require quick response," she replied simply, accepting his handshake briefly. Before continuing her equipment preparation, delayed action means expanded consequences. Lieutenant Mitchell coordinated with federal agencies, filing reports that would influence emergency response protocols at facilities throughout the region. EPA's Emergency Response Division capabilities exceed standard assumptions about civilian emergency support. Future incident planning should include early federal specialist notification. The recommendation would be implemented within 6 months, creating rapid response protocols that position specialists like Dr. Caldwell for immediate deployment to chemical emergencies rather than routine inspection duties. Sergeant Crawford filed incident reports that documented exceptional individual performance under crisis conditions. Civilian specialists demonstrated tactical capabilities and technical expertise that prevented mass casualty incidents through independent action. When backup support was unavailable, his documentation would be referenced in emergency management training programs for years afterward, teaching the importance of recognizing individual capabilities that might exceed normal assessment criteria. Officer Patterson approached Dr. Caldwell as she loaded her equipment into an unmarked EPA vehicle. "Ma'am, I want to apologize again for my initial assumptions. Today taught me about judging people's capabilities based on appearances rather than qualifications. Everyone makes assumptions based on limited information," she replied without criticism. "Experience provides better assessment criteria than first impressions." Around Riverside Chemical Plant, cleanup crews worked under normal safety protocols, processing contaminated materials and conducting environmental testing that would confirm complete neutralization of chemical hazards. The facility would reopen within 72 hours with enhanced safety systems and revised Emergency procedures. The story spread through Denver's emergency response community with the inevitable embellishments that characterized memorable incidents. But the essential facts remained consistent. A federal specialist had resolved a regional chemical crisis in less than 8 minutes when specialized backup was hours away. Within the Denver Fire Department, 3 minutes entered the vocabulary as shorthand for rapid decisive action that prevented disasters through individual initiative rather than committee planning or extensive resource deployment. Morrison instituted monthly emergency response training that emphasized individual preparation and rapid decision-making. Using Dr. Caldwell's performance as an example of how proper training and equipment could enable exceptional results under crisis conditions, the phrase "backup was 3 hours out" became part of regional emergency management folklore, representing situations where waiting for optimal resources meant accepting unacceptable consequences. 6 months later, EPA's Emergency Response Division received expanded funding for specialist training and rapid deployment capabilities, with program development based directly on incident analysis from Riverside Chemical Plant. Dr. Caldwell's name appeared in federal emergency response manuals, training curricula, and policy documents that would influence chemical emergency preparedness nationwide. Her demonstration that individual expertise could resolve crises requiring team responses changed assumptions about emergency resource planning and specialist deployment. Tommy Chun returned to his maintenance duties with comprehensive chemical safety training and authority to implement emergency shutdowns without supervisor approval. His experience led to facility-wide safety improvements that eliminated single points of failure in emergency response systems. The families who had been evacuated from residential areas near the plant received notification letters explaining that swift federal response had prevented chemical exposure that could have required long-term medical monitoring and treatment. Children who had missed afternoon classes due to emergency evacuation returned to schools where teachers used the incident as examples of how proper training and individual responsibility could protect entire communities from dangerous situations. At Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital, emergency department staff developed enhanced chemical exposure protocols based on treatment procedures used for Chun's recovery, improving response capabilities for future incidents. The Riverside chemical incident became part of institutional memory that influenced emergency preparedness throughout Colorado, ensuring that Dr. Caldwell's demonstration of rapid crisis resolution would benefit future generations facing similar threats. Her unmarked EPA vehicle disappeared into Denver traffic, carrying someone whose 8 minutes of exceptional performance had prevented disaster for thousands of people and changed emergency response expectations throughout the region. For more stories of individuals who prove that expertise and determination can overcome any crisis, no matter how impossible the odds may seem. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.